Hello, everybody, and welcome into this special Election Day episode of the Pack-A-Day podcast here on YouTube. I'm your host, Andy Herman. I'm not going to be covering the election. I'm sure that will disappoint you. I have a lot to get to from a football standpoint, but let's jump in right away. And I think we probably have to start by discussing the fact that the Packers had their first positive COVID test, and A.J. Dillon tests positive. He goes on the COVID injured list. And not only that, two potential contacts that he was in close contact with Jamal Williams and Kamal Martin, who could be affected for this Thursday's game, assuming that that goes on according to plan. If it is just in fact Jamal Williams and Kamal Martin and A.J. Dillon, I would expect that that game goes off on Thursday. If they all of a sudden find that all three are positive and that there are additional positive tests that come back prior to that, then you'd be probably looking at maybe a doubleheader on Monday or a Tuesday game would be my guess. But that's still a ways away. We'll know a lot more on that as Tuesday and Wednesday goes on, and if Green Bay actually makes that trip out to Santa Clara or not. Those will all be things that'll be very much and oft discussed over the course of the next couple days. But I just wanted to kind of go over that, bring that up. I think one of the interesting concepts here, and I talked a little bit about this to Aaron Nagler on Let's Talk Football over on Cheesehead TV. If in fact the running back room was somehow, all of them got COVID, I guess you will, if the bug spread throughout that room, I think it's really interesting in the fact that you could potentially have Tyler Ervin, who's been in the receiver room and been working with the wide receivers since the beginning of training camp, really kind of be a saving grace in this game as somebody who's available as a running back. It's probably not ideal when he's coming off an injury. He's got that wrist issue. They haven't had him returning punts, save for the last one last week. So I don't think you want to have him tote the rock, 30 times in a game. But the fact that they could have a running back active, if in fact Jamal Williams and A.J. Dillon aren't able to go, and we know already A.J. Dillon will not be ready to go. Who knows if Dexter Williams was in that running back room as well? Who knows if Aaron Jones is going to be able to go this week against San Francisco? So there's a lot in the air just with injuries and people coming back from injury, people potentially coming back from IR, whether it be Allen Lazard or Christian Kirksey, players who got hurt, players who are coming back. There's so many variables up in the air, and I'm obviously not going to spend a ton of time going over it today because simply put, we don't know the answer at this point, but it's going to be very, very interesting to see how all of those little nuances and intricacies play their way out. And as we get closer to that Thursday night football game, again, assuming that it does go off without a hitch, which is no guarantee at this point. San Francisco, also a ton of injuries already, and then they announced on Monday that Jimmy Garoppolo and George Kittle are both going to be out for extended periods of time. I mentioned last week that Green Bay really had the opportunity to put the final dagger in Minnesota. Now, that dagger is pretty well inserted anyway, and it's going to be really tough for Minnesota to get back in any sort of playoff race with the record that they have. But Green Bay had the opportunity to put the finishing touches on them, and they didn't. Now, do I think that's going to come back and haunt them and have Minnesota make the playoffs? I don't. That loss certainly could haunt them, but now they have another opportunity this Thursday to really put another potential dagger in the San Francisco 49ers. That NFC West is brutal. All right, the Rams, the Seahawks, the Cardinals, the 49ers, all of them are going to be competing for playoff spots. Now with Nick Mullins probably having to play extended time at quarterback, George Kittle gone, all the injuries that they've already suffered, Green Bay has the opportunity to give them a losing record and really hurt their playoff chances. And you don't want to have to face San Francisco in the playoffs. It's very unlikely that that game would ever be in San Francisco, but even in Green Bay, maybe even more so in Green Bay, as we just saw what Minnesota did against the Packers in cold weather, and Green Bay wasn't up to the task. Period, you don't want to see San Francisco in the playoffs when all of a sudden Jimmy Garoppolo and Dee Ford and George Kittle and Deebo Samuel and all of a sudden these guys all start coming back. You don't want to see that team in the playoffs. So this is an opportunity not only to get a win on the road, exercise some demons in San Francisco / Santa Clara, but really potentially put a loss in the loss column for the 49ers and really make it difficult for them to make the playoffs as well. So this is a really big game for Green Bay, especially when you consider they just came off a loss. They have the opportunity to maybe, not stick a dagger in the 49ers, but really make things much more difficult for them. It's a team you don't want to see later. It's a big opportunity, and I think they need to take advantage of it with a skeleton crew playing for the 49ers this week. All right, my main topic today, though, is going to be my defensive grades. Literally just finished them up about 15 minutes ago as I'm recording this. Let me start with my top graded, players this week. I only had 4 players on defense that graded in the positive. Adrian Amos was number 1 for the second straight week. He did have a pretty bad missed tackle on one play where Dalvin Cook got in the open field. But outside of that, I thought he had another really solid game. He was one of the only consistent players from a tackling standpoint outside of that one play. And I just really liked his overall performance in this game. But one thing that you want to know is if your highest graded defender is a plus 0.4 and it's a safety, things have gone very, very bad. So the fact that his grade wasn't that high, that he's your last line of defense and he's the player grading the highest, probably not a good thing. And that was certainly the case. I don't think I need to tell you just how abysmal that this tape looked. I already mentioned it yesterday. When I go back and I watch the condensed version of the game, it looked just as bad as the tape that I originally, the live action that we all originally watched. And then when I go back and watch the All-22, same exact thing. Kyle Shanahan has to be basically cackling with the fact of how many cutback lanes there were for Dalvin Cook in the running game. Most of them he took advantage of. There were a couple that he did not take advantage of. I think there was even some more yards out there, which is scary to think of. And I can just guarantee you that Kyle Shanahan's having a field day scheming what he's going to do against this Packers defense based on what he saw on tape, probably going back to the 2 games last year when they faced each other and now looking at this tape against Minnesota. I know that he's probably not super stoked about who's injured for his team in this game, but he's going to see some opportunities to run the football on Green Bay. I'm not saying anything shocking there, but there were legitimately a lot of gaps. But Adrian Amos, number 1 on my list. Jair Alexander, this all depends on how you want to grade his pass interference play. If you thought it was an egregious pass interference play and a big play for Minnesota because of it, you probably are going to grade Jair down a little bit more than I did. I give him a slight negative on the grade just because I thought maybe he got a little bit handsy at the end when he didn't need to. But in my opinion, that was not a play that should have been called pass interference. I thought he had good coverage. I thought Kirk Cousins overthrew it. Maybe if Kirk Cousins throws that ball, right on the money and Jair's maybe grappling a little bit, okay, I still don't like it, but I could live with it. But the fact that the ball wasn't even close, Jefferson wasn't even really certainly wasn't making a play on the ball. Jair, I didn't think did anything egregious that would have warranted the flag there. So I thought overall he had a solid game. Probably could have made a couple better plays in the run game. Again, didn't grade really big here, but still, when you have basically the entire team grade in the negative, the one guy that for the most part didn't allow completions again, and maybe one ticky-tacky pass interference call, he's still probably going to be one of the best graded players in the game, and he was once again. Number 3, a very, very slight positive, Kenny Clark, plus 0.15, which is, again, basically a neutral grade. I thought he actually played pretty well. I had a lot of double teams that he was facing, got off of a couple blocks, would have had maybe a couple more pressures had the ball not, come out of Cousins' hand in less than 2 seconds because the corners were playing so far off once again. So was it a great game from Kenny Clark? No, it certainly wasn't. But again, when you don't have many players grade in the positive, somebody that grades just barely above average is going to get the shout out. And, because of that today, Kenny Clark was 3rd on my list. I only had 4, players grade in the positive, period. The 3 I just mentioned, and then Oren Burks, who I think played 3 or 4 snaps. In one of them, he had a decent play on. So he ends up with a plus 0.1 grade on the day because basically he didn't play enough snaps probably to get in the negative is what it really comes down to. So those are my top 3. My bottom 3, Josh Jackson was number 1. And a few things stood out here. For the second straight week, Green Bay went 3-man rush, 8-man coverage. The coverage worked, save for the guy that Josh Jackson was covering one-on-one. Last week it went for a touchdown. This week it was a pass interference. Now, again, your mileage may vary here on whether you think that was a pass interference on Josh Jackson. I don't necessarily know that it should have been called pass interference, but it definitely should have been called illegal contact. Once again, just getting very handsy on the wide receiver about 7-8 yards downfield, which is illegal contact. Should have given them an automatic first down instead of having to kick a field goal in that situation. So that was a really big play. There was another play where Adam Thielen catches it, basically at or behind the line of scrimmage. Jackson comes up, misses the tackle, can't get the guy down, and ends up going for a 12-yard gain. There was another play where he did not fill where he was supposed to on a running assignment, and the play ends up going for big yards. A couple other plays where he allowed a completion, missed a tackle. Just a really tough game for Josh Jackson in this one, even though he wasn't targeted a ton. And if you look at his overall statistics, I think it was 1 completion for like 9 yards. But when you put the whole body of work together, just a really tough game for Josh Jackson. Number 2, Rashawn Gary just didn't get off blocks. And then in the red zone, there was a play where Delvin Cook got a touchdown. They ran right at Rashawn Gary, basically had a little bit of a double team on him, but just washed him completely out of the play. Struggled to get off of blocks. They had a couple other plays where he didn't fill his gap the way that you would have liked him to. Just a disappointing game for Rashawn Gary. The one thing that I always said that, Rashawn Gary would live up to the hype to would be as a really solid run defender. He struggled in that regards. He's coming off the injury a couple weeks ago. I thought he looked really good, probably a stretch, but I thought he looked good in the first few games of the season before his injury. I thought the last 2 games have been by far his worst 2 games of the season coming back from injury. So hopefully that's the main thing, and it's just that he's not playing at 100%, and that's why the grades are a little bit lower. And then number 3 was Chris Barnes. Thought he just ran himself out of some plays, got blocked relatively easily on a couple other ones. Just gap integrity. There were multiple times where you saw Barnes and Martin in a defensive tackle, like all lined up in the same gap. Just those are the sort of things. And when I looked at this, the grades as a whole, obviously there were a lot of grades in the negative when you only have, 3 players and basically Oren Burks who played 4 snaps, grade in the positive. There's going to be a ton of negative grades. But when I looked at this as a whole, I really saw this as a team defense issue. Part of it is scheme. Part of it is how they played this game. Part of it is missed tackles, missed assignments, gap integrity, things like that. But it was just overall team defense. You did not see cohesion. You did not see guys covering for one another. You didn't see, okay, one guy's going to take this gap. I'm going to fill in for you because you just left that gap. Like, just complementary football. We usually talk about complementary football as like the offense helping the defense helping the offense, the special teams helping both, so on and so forth, and having an overall game where you have complementary football. There's also complementary football when your own unit is on the field, and the defense did not play cohesive complementary football. And to me, that was one of the bigger issues when I went back and I watched this tape in greater detail. That's going to do it for me. I hope you enjoyed the grades today. I'm hoping to be back tomorrow with the offensive grades. We'll see how far I get. Sometimes the one that had more snaps takes me a little bit more than one night to grade, but hopefully I'm back with those tomorrow. Otherwise, maybe I'll be back tomorrow breaking down the Packers' big trade that they made at the trade deadline. I wouldn't lose sleep over it. I don't know that that's going to happen. As you're listening to this, hey, maybe Brian Gutekunst already made a huge trade. So it could be exciting. We'll see what happens. And if I can say one thing before I go, I'm not going to tell you who to vote for, but I do ask, please vote. Do your civic duty. Get out there if you haven't already, and make sure to go out and vote.